empires are usually forged by swords, but the Habsburgs conquered with weddings, rings, not blood, until their own blood turned against them. And the final price? A broken king, Charles II. The tale of the mighty Habsburg dynasty does not begin with swords clashing on the battlefield, but with vows whispered at the altar. Where other kingdoms expanded through rivers of blood, the Habsburgs expanded through rings and veils, using marriages as their deadliest weapon. It was their creed, their guiding principle. Let others wage war. You, fortunate Austria, marry. Elegant words on the surface, but in truth, it was a ruthless political strategy that reshaped Europe itself. By wedding their sons and daughters into the royal houses of Spain, Burgundy, Bohemia, and far beyond, the Habsburgs spun a web of alliances so vast that people said the sun never set on their dominions. In 1477, Maximilian I sealed this strategy when he married Mary of Burgundy. With her hand came not just beauty, but a fortune of lands, stretching across what we now know as Belgium and the Netherlands. And less than 2 decades later, the dynasty struck yet another bargain. Philip the Handsome, son of Maximilian, wed Joanna of Castile. That marriage did not simply unite 2 hearts. It bound Austria to Spain, forging a line that tied together 2 of Europe's most powerful realms. These were not love stories. They were power plays, treaties disguised as weddings, and vows spoken for empires, not for souls. By the dawn of the 16th century, one name echoed through every palace in Europe: the Habsburgs. In Vienna, Madrid, Brussels, and Naples, their presence was undeniable. They had given the world rulers like Charles V, whose empire stretched across Europe and spilled into the Americas, and Philip II of Spain, who reigned over territories so vast that his dominion reached from the Old World into the New. As historian Geoffrey Parker once said, Habsburg marriages were not simple unions of love or ceremony. They were the very foundation of European politics. In this dynasty, family ties were more powerful than any army, shaping nations more deeply than any war ever could. But every empire carries a hidden cost. For the Habsburgs, it did not come in the form of a lost battle or a crumbled fortress. Their price was far more insidious, hidden in their own blood. By binding themselves again and again to the same noble houses, often to cousins, sometimes even to nieces, they created a circle of blood so tight that escape was impossible. At first, the warning signs were faint, a quirk here, an oddity there, but by the 17th century, those small peculiarities had become impossible to ignore. In portraits painted with pride, the faces of kings and queens revealed the truth. The proud Habsburg Jaw, once seen as a symbol of nobility, now appeared as a genetic curse. Elongated chins, heavy lower lips, and features that spoke not of glory, but of decline. In the 16th century, the warning signs were easy to dismiss. Courtiers and chroniclers brushed them aside, calling the strange features of Habsburg heirs nothing more than quirks of lineage. Outwardly, the empire thrived, expanding its reach with each marriage, but beneath the glitter of new crowns and titles, the risks quietly multiplied. Every wedding that added new lands also carried with it the silent burden of a shrinking gene pool. It was only a matter of time. A strategy that seemed brilliant on parchment, marriages that stitched half of Europe together, would, in practice, prove catastrophic. And soon a king would be born who carried within his body the full weight of centuries of inbreeding. He would be cradled not as a symbol of strength, but as a living omen of decline. The alliances that once appeared clever began to tighten like a rope around the dynasty's own neck. By the mid-16th century, the Spanish branch of the Habsburgs pushed this policy further than any royal house before them. Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch of his age, sought to preserve not only his empire, but also the bloodline itself, untainted by outsiders.
In 1570, he took Anna of Austria as his bride, his own niece. The Pope, as always, granted his blessing. Rome had never met a dowry it disliked, and what should have been a wedding was, in truth, nothing more than a trade agreement sealed with vows. This was no isolated incident. It became a pattern, repeated with each generation. Cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, nephew to aunt, marriages sanctified not by love but by papal documents that stamped each union with holy approval. The family tree of Europe's greatest dynasty no longer resembled a tree at all. It was a twisted branch, gnarled and dark, circling endlessly back upon itself. At court, no one dared speak the truth. They called it purity. They called it divine favor. But behind the velvet drapes of royal nurseries, the reality told another story. Picture Madrid in the early 16th century. Heavy curtains trapping stale air inside nurseries filled with frail, sickly children. Wet nurses bent over gilded cradles, whispering desperate prayers as they tried to feed infants whose jaws would not close, whose tongues were too large for their mouths. Outside, artists like Velázquez painted glowing portraits of regal heirs in gilded armor, proud and poised. But those canvases were lies. Behind the brushstrokes, servants wiped drool from lips, priests muttered prayers over children too weak to stand, and whispered fears spread through the palace that the dynasty was slowly poisoning itself. By 1649, the pattern deepened. Philip IV of Spain wed Mariana of Austria, his very own niece. To the outside world, it looked like brilliance. Madrid tied more tightly to Vienna, the empire strengthened by blood. But inside the palace, whispers told another truth. It was not an alliance. It was another stitch in the shroud being woven over the dynasty's future. Diplomats noted the oddities of the royal children, yet the chronicles of the court wrapped those warnings in gold leaf and incense. Weakness was rebranded as sensitivity, deformity dressed up as noble distinction. The truth was buried beneath ceremony. By the 1650s and 60s, the so-called Habsburg Jaw was no longer just a family resemblance. It had become a symbol of doom. A chin so exaggerated it seemed to demand a throne of its own, a lip so heavy that words melted into mumbles. These were not marks of majesty, but of entrapment. What had once meant safety and control over sprawling kingdoms now meant risk, frailty, and the chilling realization that this great lineage was running out of strength.
The Spanish court worked tirelessly to hide the truth. They drowned weakness in pageantry, staging grand processions through the streets of Madrid, filling cathedrals with choirs that shook the walls, and commissioning portraits that radiated power and majesty. To the people, the image was clear. Spain was strong, its rulers unshakable. But the ambassadors who visited the court saw beyond the gold and incense. In their letters home, they whispered another story of an empire balancing precariously on a bloodline too fragile to endure. And it was within this fragile system, held together by papal seals and cousin marriages, that a child was born in 1661. His name was Charles. To the world, he was the heir to Spain's vast dominions, but in truth, he was something else entirely, the living embodiment of everything centuries of intermarriage had created. By the 17th century, what had once been whispered in hushed voices could no longer be ignored. The so-called Habsburg Jaw had become the dynasty's most infamous signature. Once described as noble, even distinguished, it now stood as a warning etched into flesh. With each generation, the trait grew sharper, crueler. A chin jutting so far forward, it warped the entire face. Lips too heavy to close over protruding teeth. Tongues swollen, too large for the mouths that held them. These were not accidents of fate. They were the scars of a system that had folded back upon itself again and again until the bloodline became a circle drawn too tightly to escape. Even the mighty Philip IV, immortalized by the painter Velázquez in portraits of grandeur, could not hide the truth. His gaze seemed resolute, his armor gleamed, his cloak carried the symbols of power, but his very body bore the marks of the family's genetic trap. And in 1649, when he married Mariana of Austria, his own niece, daughter of Emperor Ferdinand III, the union was celebrated as another masterstroke of alliance. Yet in reality, it was something darker, the tightening of a noose around a dynasty that had nowhere else to go. In Madrid, the truth could not be spoken aloud. Ambassadors wrote carefully worded letters back to Paris and Vienna, their horror veiled in diplomacy. They described the children of these unions as delicate, sickly, strange. Yet in the official chronicles, the words were softened. A child was not weak, he was sensitive, not deformed, but noble, not slow, but contemplative. The world was never meant to see the truth. Oil and gold leaf disguised it in portraits. Incense clouded it in cathedrals. Processions buried it beneath chants of divine favor. But masks do not last forever. By the mid-17th century, the dynasty was producing heirs who could not speak clearly, who struggled to chew their food, who needed constant care just to survive childhood. The infamous Habsburg Jaw was no longer a private embarrassment. It was a public warning, a grim reminder of what happens when the pursuit of bloodline purity defies the laws of nature itself. In the quiet of royal nurseries, servants wiped drool from trembling lips and whispered prayers over children too weak to thrive. The consequences of centuries of intermarriage lay bare in velvet cradles.
And foreign eyes noticed. A Venetian ambassador wrote that the Spanish royal children seemed constantly unwell, fragile shadows of what heirs should be. A French diplomat described with dismay the frail appearance of princes meant to hold together a sprawling empire. Their letters, tucked into dispatches, revealed a chilling truth. Europe had begun to suspect that the strength of Spain's dynasty was little more than an illusion, a golden mask hiding decay. Meanwhile, Spain itself was crumbling beneath the weight of its own grandeur. Silver still flowed from the mines of the Americas, filling royal coffers, but corruption drained it away as quickly as it came. Armies that once thundered across Europe now struggled to be paid. Rebellions simmered at the empire's fragile edges. And yet, in Madrid, the court clung desperately to pageantry, parades, processions, and portraits. To admit weakness was unthinkable, for weakness meant instability, and instability could shatter an empire built on illusion. This tension between majesty and decay defined the Spanish Habsburgs of the 17th century. In their portraits, Philip IV and Mariana of Austria stood tall, draped in velvet, crowned in gold. But behind palace doors, the truth was darker. Illness stalked the royal household. Every birth was shadowed by fear, not that a child might die, but that he might live and yet never be fit to rule. And it was into this gilded cage of pomp and decay that the next heir arrived. In 1661, Charles, the long-awaited son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, was born. To the world, his birth was celebrated as a promise of renewal. But to those who saw him, it was something else entirely. From the moment he opened his eyes, it was clear. The dynasty had pushed its bloodline to the breaking point. Charles II of Spain entered the world on November 6, 1661, inside the Grand Royal Palace of Madrid. He was the long-awaited heir to King Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, the child upon whom an empire's hopes rested. But from the very moment of his birth, unease swept through the room. Midwives crossed themselves in silence, Priests muttered hurried prayers, and whispers spread among the attendants. Something was not right. The infant's tongue was too large for his mouth. His jaw jutted forward in the unmistakable mark of the Habsburg line. Feeding him was a struggle, each attempt shadowed by the fear that he might choke. The royal nursery, meant to echo with songs and celebration, instead became a chamber of worry, filled with velvet canopies, incense smoke, and desperate prayers. The chronicles, of course, told a different story. Official records hailed him as a blessed child, his most Catholic majesty. But behind the closed doors of the palace, nurses knew the truth. To keep him alive, they tilted his head at just the right angle so he would not suffocate while feeding. And as the years passed, his frailty became undeniable. He could not stand until the age of 4, and even then his steps were unsteady, his body weak. His speech, too, was distorted, slurred by the shape of his jaw and the weight of his tongue, so much so that even his courtiers often struggled to understand him. This was not the birth of a savior. It was the unveiling of a dynasty's curse.
The court physicians tried everything their 17th century knowledge could offer. Again and again, they bled the boy, draining vitality from a child who already had so little to give. They forced purges, emetics, and bitter herbal concoctions upon him, desperate to balance the body's humors. But when these remedies failed, the blame shifted away from medicine and toward the supernatural. Priests were summoned, holy water sprinkled, exorcisms performed in hushed Latin as Charles whimpered, too weak to resist. To them, his frailties were not the result of centuries of inbreeding, but of demons clinging to the air of Spain. The nursery of Europe's most powerful empire had become a theater of desperation, where science and superstition collided, and neither could save the boy whose very blood rebelled against him. Foreign ambassadors caught glimpses of the truth. Some described the young prince as sickly, frail, and melancholic. One observer wrote bluntly that the child seemed incapable of survival. Another confided that his appearance was so unsettling, it provoked fear. But these words never reached the public. Instead, official portraits painted him as a solemn child dressed in silk, gazing outward as though already burdened with the weight of an empire. Paintings became masks, shields against reality, crafted not to show the truth, but to conceal fragility beneath the illusion of divine authority. Inside the walls of the Alcazar Palace, life revolved around one fragile figure. Every cough from young Charles sent waves of panic through the court. Every fever triggered prayers whispered across the kingdom. His mother, Queen Mariana, clung to him desperately, seeing in his survival the final hope of the Habsburg dynasty. His father, Philip IV, weary from years of rule, placed upon the boy the weight of an empire that stretched across continents. But those expectations rested on the frail shoulders of a child who could barely walk unaided, who tired with the smallest effort, who seemed always on the edge of collapse. When Philip IV died in 1665, Charles was just 4 years old. In a blaze of pageantry, he was crowned King of Spain. Choirs filled the air with hymns. Incense rose in thick clouds. Nobles bent the knee in loyalty. Yet behind the grandeur, everyone knew the truth. The fate of Spain's vast empire now rested in the hands of a boy who could not govern himself, let alone rule the world's largest dominion. His mother took the reins as regent, while the courtiers whispered anxiously, not about his reign, but about how long he might survive at all. And as the years passed, Charles did not grow stronger. He simply grew older. His body remained frail, his mind clouded, his speech so slurred it was often unintelligible. He became the living embodiment of the dynasty's hidden curse, paraded as a monarch while envoys sent home chilling reports of a king unfit to rule,
unfit to produce an heir. Spain carried on with its rituals and ceremonies, but beneath the surface, fear spread like a shadow. For at the heart of the empire sat not a savior, but a warning of collapse yet to come.
When Charles II reached adulthood, the hopes of his court, that frailty and childhood might blossom into strength, were shattered. Instead, his weaknesses only deepened. The most powerful empire in Europe was now ruled by a man whose body and mind could not bear the weight of a crown. Crowned at the age of 4, he had been paraded as God's chosen monarch, draped in jewels and armor. But behind the heavy doors of the Alcazar Palace, the reality was starkly different. A king who could barely walk without support, whose speech slurred so badly that even his courtiers strained to understand him. Foreign ambassadors reported what portraits concealed. Their letters to Vienna, Paris, and London described a monarch bent and feeble, trembling with seizures, incapable of clear thought or sustained conversation. One French envoy was brutally honest. Charles, he wrote, was, quote, so ugly as to cause fear and so weak in mind and body that he is incapable of ruling, end quote. Yet Spain clung to the illusion of majesty. To admit otherwise was to admit chaos. At court, the contradiction was agonizing. Nobles and ministers propped him up, sometimes literally, ensuring he appeared in processions and festivals as though nothing were wrong. When he waved from balconies, attendants guided his arm. At banquets, he drooled into his beard, spilled wine down his chin, and sat silent as others spoke in his name. But all of this was veiled in polite words. Official records did not call him weak or broken. They called him melancholy, sensitive, devout, never acknowledging the truth that the crown of Spain rested on the head of a man who could barely function in daily life. To the Spanish people, their king was presented as chosen by God. His suffering, the priest declared, was not a curse, but a mark of sanctity, proof that he was being tested by heaven. But inside the corridors of power, the truth was undeniable. Ministers scrambled to hold together an empire in decline, armies went unpaid, revolts simmered in distant provinces, and the once endless silver from the Americas now trickled away. At the center of it all sat Charles II, not as a ruler, but as a symbol, a living reminder of the Habsburgs' obsession with purity and the price it had exacted. As Charles entered his 20s and 30s, a darker problem loomed over every council: succession. He had no children, and whispers grew louder that he never would. Desperate physicians subjected him to humiliating treatments, potions, bloodletting, and bizarre rituals meant to spark vigor. Priests pressed holy relics to his frail body, as though sanctity might succeed where medicine failed. Meanwhile, foreign courts speculated openly who would inherit Spain once the inevitable happened. The spectacle of a king incapable of producing an heir was more than a personal tragedy. It was a geopolitical crisis. Europe watched uneasily as an empire stretching from the Americas to the Low Countries, from Naples to the Philippines, balanced on the fragile body of a childless king. Still, the dynasty clung to hope. Marriages were arranged with the urgency of war pacts, each new union treated as a last gamble to preserve the Habsburg line. But behind the incense, prayers, and ceremonies, one truth remained unspoken. Spain's survival was slipping through his king's hands.
In 1679, the court of Spain staged a grand wedding. Charles II was married to Marie-Louise of Orleans, the radiant niece of France's King Louis XIV. The match was more than a union. It was a treaty, meant to cement peace between the Bourbon and Habsburg houses, the two greatest dynasties of Europe. But behind the shimmering pageantry, anxiety ran deep. Marie-Louise was young, beautiful, and full of life. Charles, by contrast, was frail, awkward, and often incoherent. On their wedding night, she is said to have wept, frightened by her husband's appearance, his manner, and the grim future she could already sense. Year after year, the Spanish court waited for the longed-for news of a pregnancy, but no heir came. Desperate doctors prescribed exotic aphrodisiacs and humiliating treatments. Priests pressed relics against the king's body, praying that holiness might succeed where medicine had failed. Yet the truth could not be disguised forever. Charles II was incapable of producing an heir. A decade passed in disappointment, and in 1689, Marie-Louise was dead. Officially, her death was attributed to illness and melancholy, but whispers in foreign courts suggested something darker, that she had simply wasted away, trapped in a marriage where hope was impossible and joy could not survive. Spain, already fragile, now faced a crisis. The dynasty had no heir, and time was running out. By 1690, a new queen was chosen, Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess from a family famed for its fertility. Her sisters had filled nurseries across Europe with children, and ministers prayed that her bloodline alone might save Spain. Once again, prayers rose like incense, rituals were performed, and all of Europe waited. Would the Habsburg line continue, or had the curse already taken hold too deeply to be undone? But the outcome was the same. Charles' second marriage was cold, joyless, and fruitless. Maria Anna of Neuburg soon realized that she had not been brought to Spain to share a life with her husband, but to carry an impossible burden, the task of saving a dying dynasty. Her letters hint at growing frustration, even bitterness, as she endured endless medical examinations and humiliating interventions, each one designed to coax an heir from a union that could never produce one. Meanwhile, the Spanish court drowned its despair in ceremony. Processions filled the streets, feasts crowded the calendar, and festivals echoed with choirs, all designed to project stability while concealing desperation. But foreign eyes were not fooled. The French ambassador described a court in denial, clinging to rituals while the empire rotted from within. The Dutch and the English, too, saw the writing on the wall. Spain was ruled by a king incapable of ruling, married twice yet childless, his body too broken to fulfill the most basic duty of monarchy. The question of succession was no longer a whisper, it had become the central obsession of European politics. For Charles himself, the strain was unbearable. His health collapsed further in the 1690s. Seizures shook his body, fevers left him bedridden, and long periods of near incapacity became common. His wives prayed for miracles that never came. His ministers schemed in the shadows, drafting treaties that might preserve Spain after his inevitable death. And the people of Castile watched their king with pity and dread. Pale, trembling, waving weakly from processions like a puppet propped up by attendants. Charles II was a monarch in name, but never in strength.
The marriages that were meant to rescue the dynasty had only underlined its doom. Spain remained without an heir, its people without certainty, and Europe without stability. With each passing year, one truth became clearer. When Charles II died, he would carry with him the last fragile thread holding the Spanish Habsburgs together. By the final decade of the 17th century, Charles was no longer a king in any real sense. He was a living symbol of decline. His body, frail since birth, now seemed to collapse inward upon itself. Foreign envoys reported with growing horror. The Austrian ambassador described him as senile long before his years, racked by seizures, unable to digest even simple food, incapable of sustained thought. The French envoy was blunter still. Charles was, he wrote, short, lame, epileptic, senile, and so ugly as to cause fear. Words never spoken aloud in Madrid, but circulated quietly among Europe's courts, revealing the truth Spain itself dared not admit, that its most Catholic majesty was a man destroyed by the weight of his own bloodline. Inside the palace, desperation reigned. Physicians clung to the old rituals of medicine, bleeding him again and again, draining what little vitality remained. Enemas, purges, and foul concoctions of herbs, minerals, and animal parts were forced upon him, each one a futile attempt to spark strength.
And when science failed, superstition took its place. Priests whispered exorcisms in Latin, as though demons rather than centuries of inbreeding were to blame. In one infamous episode, they declared that Charles's impotence must be the work of witches. They searched for curses in his chambers, convinced that black magic, not genetics, had stripped the king of his strength. The royal apartments, heavy with incense and candle smoke, had become a grim theater where fear and ritual played endlessly, while reason was left outside the door. By the mid-1690s, desperation could no longer be hidden. Charles appeared less and less in public, and when he did, the sight shocked even his loyal subjects. Pale and trembling, drool clinging to his beard, his body so frail that attendants had to hold him upright. At banquets, he spilled wine down his chin. In councils, he struggled to follow the simplest of discussions before falling into a vacant silence. Yet Spain clung to its illusions. Processions, trumpets, and gilded thrones still surrounded him. But the facade fooled no one. The empire's decline was no longer an abstract fear. It was written in the body of its king. Maria Anna of Neuburg, his second queen, bore the burden with growing frustration. She knew the truth, that Charles could never give Spain the heir it demanded. Her role as wife became a hollow mask, her influence shifting instead into the shadows of politics. She aligned herself with court factions vying for power in the inevitable aftermath, caught between the weight of a collapsing present and the uncertainty of the future. As the 1690s bled into a new century, the crisis could no longer be ignored. Charles's health withered away. His body, skeletal and jaundiced, looked less like that of a 38-year-old king and more like a man twice his age, ravaged by illness and exhaustion. By 1700, the court knew the end had come. Priests crowded into his chambers, murmuring last rites over the broken monarch. Candles flickered low as courtiers gathered in the corridors, whispering nervously, waiting for the words that would shake all of Europe. For when Charles II died, it would not just mark the end of a reign, it would mark the end of a dynasty.
On November 1st, 1700, Charles II of Spain drew his final breath. He was just 39 years old, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs. He left behind no children, no heir, no continuation of a dynasty that had once ruled half the known world. His frail, emaciated body was dressed in royal robes, placed in a coffin, and given a funeral of immense grandeur. Incense filled the air. Choirs sang hymns of devotion. Chroniclers praised his faith. But beneath the pageantry, all understood the truth. The dynasty had not fallen to conquest or defeat. It had rotted from within, undone by its own obsession with bloodline purity. His passing was more than a personal tragedy. It was a European catastrophe. The Spanish succession, an empire stretching from the Americas to the Low Countries, was suddenly open. France, Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic circled like vultures, ready to seize their share. Charles's death did not close a chapter. It ripped open a new one. Within a year, Europe was at war, a brutal conflict that would rage for more than a decade and claim hundreds of thousands of lives. As his body lay in state, courtiers and clerics tried desperately to preserve the illusion of dignity. Perfume masked the stench of decay, embroidered robes concealed the frailty of the corpse beneath. But no incense, no chant, no golden procession could hide the truth. Charles II's death marked the end of a dynasty. Spain's future would be carved up by foreign powers, and the great Habsburg dream of an eternal empire dissolved in the frail, broken body of its last king. The death of Charles II in 1700 did not simply end a dynasty, it set Europe ablaze. With no heir to inherit Spain's vast dominions, the question of succession became the central crisis of the age. Spain controlled not only the Iberian Peninsula, but Naples, Sicily,
the Netherlands, and vast territories across the Americas. Whoever claimed this empire would hold the balance of power in Europe. France, Austria, and England all knew the stakes, and none would allow a rival to seize it uncontested. Charles's will named Philip of Anjou, grandson of the French king Louis XIV, as his heir. For Louis, it was nothing short of triumph. His blood now sat on the throne of Spain. It promised the unthinkable, the uniting of France and Spain into a single Bourbon superpower. But for Austria and England, it was a nightmare. A Franco-Spanish alliance threatened to dominate the continent, leaving all others in its shadow. Within months of Charles's death, alliances were forged, armies mustered, and Europe marched to war. Thus began the War of the Spanish Succession. From 1701 to 1714, Europe became a battlefield. French and Spanish forces clashed against a grand alliance led by Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, and later Prussia. The fighting stretched from the plains of Spain to the fields of Italy, from the Low Countries to faraway colonies. Legendary battles were etched into history. Blenheim in 1704, Ramillies in 1706, where commanders like the Duke of Marlborough and Prince Eugene of Savoy shattered Bourbon ambitions. Cities burned, thousands of soldiers fell, civilians starved, and entire regions lay devastated under the weight of a war born from the death of a single broken king. For Spain itself, the War of the Spanish Succession was fought both within and without. Some regions pledged loyalty to Philip of Anjou, others resisted, splitting the kingdom from the inside. The once unshakable empire was reduced to a prize, fought over by peasants, nobles, and soldiers alike, pawns in the larger game of Europe's great powers. The Spanish people, long weary of decline, bore the heaviest burden: famine, crushing taxes, and the ruin of war, while foreign courts coldly debated their fate.
At last, after more than a decade of bloodshed, exhaustion forced compromise. In 1713, the Treaty of Utrecht and the agreements that followed in 1714 ended the conflict. Philip of Anjou was confirmed as Philip V of Spain, but only under one condition: Spain and France would never unite into a single empire. The price was steep. Spain lost the Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia to Austria, while Britain seized Gibraltar and Minorca. The empire endured, but diminished. Its golden age was gone, its dominance broken. And the legacy of the Habsburgs was clear. Their obsession with preserving blood through marriage rather than reform had produced a monarch so broken that he dragged an empire to the brink of ruin. The war that followed his death consumed hundreds of thousands of lives and redrew the map of Europe for the century that followed. What had begun as a strategy of strength, marrying instead of fighting, had ended in weakness, in war, and in the collapse of Spain's might. For Europe, the story of the Habsburgs became a warning carved into history. Noble blood is not invincible. Divine right cannot sustain an empire. And dynastic obsession can be as deadly as any battlefield defeat. Charles II, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, remained the living symbol of that truth. His reign ended not in glory, but in ashes. And through his broken body, Europe was reminded of a chilling reality. Even the greatest dynasties are mortal.